Everyone. I'm Brad Hennings, and we're here with the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Historical Society, as well as the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims Bar Association. We're here to talk to some of the second generation of the court's chief judges, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. It's a panel discussion featuring these chief judges, including Judge William P. Green, Jr., we were supposed to include Judge Bruce E. Castle, but Judge Castle is likely not going to be able to join us today. But we do have Judge Lawrence B. Hagel and Judge Robert N. Davis. This is going to be moderated by current Judge Michael P. Allen. And the hope is the panel is going to discuss some challenges and triumphs as the court grew, the continued evolution of the institution, and share their thoughts about the court's history. Now, I'm going to ask that everyone please stay muted unless they're talking. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We will hit that at the end. But otherwise, Judge Allen is going to be directing or sort of guiding the conversation with the chief judges. With that, I'll turn it over to Jenna Zilmer for a minute.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jenna Zellmer. I'm the president of the CAVC Bar Association. Thank you all for joining. And I just want to say thank you to Judge Allen for moderating and former Chief Judges Hagel, Green, and Davis for joining today. And thanks to Brad for partnering with us with the Historical Society and the Bar Association. We hope that we can continue to do these joint presentations throughout the year. So I'll leave it at that.
With that, I will turn it over to Judge Allen. I think all of the judges on the screen need no introduction. Their reputations precede them at this point, but if you're interested in their bios, please go to the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims website, and they have very detailed bios of all of these very distinguished jurists.
Well, thanks, Brad. And so I want to thank the Historical Society and the Bar Association for this, both you, Brad, and Jenna, for putting this together. It struck me, we have an interesting institution here in the sense that it's 30-something years old now, and we have this sort of unique opportunity to look at history, but also to be part of it. And that struck me this morning when we got an email that a court employee was retiring after being at the court for 30 years. And there aren't many institutions where you can actually have the founding generation be present at the same time you're thinking about it. And so this is a great opportunity to get these done. And before I begin, we were chatting before we let the folks in from the waiting room, but I was thining in getting ready for this that this is a personal panel for me in a way, because in late 2005, I got a call from then Judge Davis asking for somebody who knew nothing about the area of veterans law, but something about federal courts to come speak at the court's judicial conference. And after a slow start, I realized that was me. And so I went and met then Judge Hagel to talk about this conference, and then met Chief Judge Green at the time. And then, of course, about 12 years later, Bob Davis was the chief judge when I became a judge on the court. And so I feel like I wasn't part of the second generation, but I was there. So I want to sort of start out with a sort of a general question for all three of you, and we'll start with Judge Green. But so each of us that have been appointed a judge has sort of the story about how they became a judge. And so just sort of provide some context about the story of your nomination. And as part of that, when you joined the court, what surprised you about being a judge? And at that point in time, did you give any consideration that you might be the chief judge? So we'll start with Judge Green. And you're muted.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I thank everyone for putting this together. I wish it was personal more so than virtual, but gives us a chance to get over the pandemic and get back to court business. My story is one that goes back to 1989, when one of my dear friends, Ron Holdaway from the JAG Corps, had been nominated to be a judge on the court. So from that moment on, I had known about the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims, or at that time, the Court of Veterans Appeals. And those 7 judges that served on there, I knew Judge Nebaker and I knew Judge Farley from my JAG experiences. And so I was serving as an immigration judge at the time. Well, not in 1989, but by 1993. While I was serving as an immigration judge, one of the judges, Judge Mankin, became seriously ill, and it appeared that there was going to be a vacancy on the court. Because of my contact with some individuals at the Department of Veterans Affairs who I had known in the military, I was approached about perhaps taking a position on the court. Being one who I always considered myself to be ready for any opportunity, I agreed to an interview, and lo and behold, the next thing I knew, the person said he was going to submit my name to President Clinton. I was serving as an immigration judge at the time and had a tremendous caseload, so it took about 9 to 10 months before I could finally get a hearing at the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. And the rest is history. In 1997, I was appointed as a judge on the court. Now, my background was mostly trial court level in the JAG Corps, as well as doing the immigration court. And I always had this feeling about an appellate court being truly the ivory tower. And so I had some reluctance, but my talking with Ron Holdaway, who at that time had been a judge for at least 6 or 7 years, he assured me that it was a great place to be, a collegial court, and it certainly was something that I knew I could adapt to because I have been known to get along with just about everyone. So I came forward to the court, and it was what I expected. I was very familiar with the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, which is also an Article I court. So I kind of mirrored their similarities. The one thing that happened when I first started, though, was I didn't have a staff. I didn't have a secretary or an executive assistant or any clerks. And fortunately, Esther Grant, who had been Judge Mankin's executive assistant, was still on board. So I asked her to help me get started as a judge. And boy, am I glad I did, because she was just fabulous. And as a side, it just so happened too that her husband was one of the individuals that interviewed me to be an immigration judge. So I offered her position. I really should say I begged her to stay, and she stayed and got me on my footing, and I got to able to hire my 2 clerks, and off we ran. What I didn't realize, though, that the court at the time had a one-touch rule. So if a motion comes in pursuant to an appeal, whatever judge, that was the motion judge, that would also become the screening judge. Well, somebody had a bright idea, the clerk of court, who was also a friend from the JAG Corps, said for me to get a flavor as to what's going on into court, we'll give you the motions. You'll have the motions practice. So I did get a good flavor of what everything was going on procedurally, but guess what? All those cases I touched became my cases as a screening judge. And before I knew it, I had piles and piles of records that I had to go to Judge Nebaker and say, please stop the spigot, because there's a skewing here that I won't be able to handle. And he accommodated me on that. And so they kind of got away from that one-touch rule for that reason. The idea that I would become chief judge of the court was sort of in the background, because at the time I joined the court, the chief judge was specifically appointed by the president. The other associate judges were paid as district court judges, and the chief judge was paid as an appellate court judge. So I figured that with Judge Nebaker being on board and perhaps maybe retiring by 2000, that I might be considered to be the chief judge, simply because I was a Clinton appointee and President Clinton at the time was the president. So that did not occur. And in fact, we had submitted some proposed legislation to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee about the court. And along with that legislation, they came back with the idea that the chief judge position would devolve to the next senior judge on the court. So that took care of the question as to who would become the next chief judge after Judge Nebaker would leave. That wasn't quite as simple, but well, actually Judge Kramer then became the chief judge, and then he held it for 4 years, and then Judge Ivers for 8 months, and then Judge Steinberg for 4 days, and then me. I was thankful that that it came out that way. It gave me a chance to really sit back and see what challenges I would have as the chief judge, especially after Judge Kramer left, because there was that gap of almost a year before I could take over officially as the chief judge. Judge Ivers was kind enough to allow me to move into the chief judge chambers while he was the chief judge, so I could get myself ready for that. So that's how I became the chief judge, and held it for 5 years. And the one thing I found out, that you seize the power of a chief judge and you grab the reins of power, and you know that immediately that they're not attached to anything. You're just the first of amongst equals. It's like herding cats. You get to do all the great administrative stuff while all the other judges can concentrate on their cases. I did try to engage them all, though, by forming committees so that everyone would have some participation in the management of the court.
Now, Chief Judge Green, I think you forgot one part of the story, if I'm not mistaken. Is there any truth to the rumor, sir, that you were in prison at the time that you were offered the job?
There is truth to that, absolutely.
Would you like to explain for those who don't know the story?
All right. As an immigration judge, part of my jurisdiction was to go to prisons in the state of Pennsylvania to hear cases involving unlawful immigrants who had committed felonies in the United States, which made them deportable. For those individuals who, in fact, were green card holders or lawful permanent residents, they had an opportunity to try to stay in the United States despite the conviction at the time. So I was conducting hearings in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, when I received a phone. The guard came in and said I had a phone call. And that phone call was from an individual at the Department of Veterans Affairs asking me about my interest in becoming a judge on the court. And I told him, of course, I would be interested. And he said, well, can you come down that afternoon? I said, not a chance. I'm in Pennsylvania. But I could be there in 2 days. And they arranged for me to have an interview with, at that time, the Secretary of VA. And I had the interview, and that was, I did report to him saying I'd just come from prison.
Well, I couldn't resist getting that on the record.
Well, and there's another thing about prisons is that I always used to say, when they said, when did you get out of the Army? I said, 1993. Where were you? I was at Fort Leavenworth. And then they say, oh, you were in Fort Leavenworth? I said, yes, but not in the prison.
Well, that is wonderful. So, so Judge Hagel, how did your story of becoming a judge come here, and was there any prison involved with you?
Well, unlike, excuse me one second. I took the telephone off the hook with the hopes that we wouldn't be interrupted. When you get to be my age, a lot of people become your friends on the telephone. So, so it rings from 8 in the morning till 6 at night. So, actually, I got involved with the court because when I was still on active duty in the Marines. I was at the General Litigation Division at the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy. And one day this piece of paper crossed my desk, and it was a news article about the creation of this court. And so I said, I was about ready to leave the service. And so I set out and wrote a letter to various service organizations and said, hey, saw this court was being created. If you would like to be involved with the court, this is my background. I'd really like to become, be a staff attorney at your organization. And one thing led to another. And after a while, I was offered a position with the Paralyzed Veterans of America, where I was for a number of years, and started their representation program at the court. So eventually I became the general counsel of that organization. And while I was there, when the court was first created, each of the judges, 7 judges at that time, were appointed for 15 years. And as the years rolled along, it became apparent to people that, look, 15 years is going to be up, and almost all these judges are going to be gone at once. And so then an effort became, started to try to figure out how to solve that. But it wasn't solved by the time that 4 of the judges had left. So there were 4 vacancies at the time that I was ultimately considered for a nomination in the court. I simply was involved because an individual in the veterans community asked me if I'd be interested. I initially said no, and I said no 2 other times. But just because I didn't see myself as a judge, I never did. And so but the 3rd time I was asked, I said, fine, you can put my name forward, and whatever happens, happens. And eventually the process developed, and I got a telephone call from the White House, said, would you be interested? And I said, yes. And then a series of interviews started, background investigations and so forth. And so I eventually was nominated as a judge of the court and then confirmed. I was not in prison when I got the call that I had actually been nominated, and that the Senate had confirmed my nomination, but I was at home. And at that time, there was in the Senate itself, there was the parties were at loggerheads about appointing judges. And so no federal judges were being confirmed at all. And of course, our court got caught up in that. But there was a push to try to get some judges in the court before the court lost 2 other judges, which was about to happen. And but it didn't look like anything was being solved. And this was in December of the final term of that particular Congress. And when a term of Congress expires, all the nominations that are made during that term also expire. And so I figured, well, it was a nice run, but so what? It didn't happen. Then the president called the Senate back to deal with the budget, because the federal budget had not yet been passed. And so that Congress came back in session. They passed the budget very quickly and had some additional time left. And so they said, well, we got all these nominations hanging around. Let's deal with them. There were ambassadors and other, executive appointments, executive department appointments. And so, again, I had no clue that this was going on. But one night, about 6 or 7 o'clock, I got a call from Chief Judge Kramer, who said to me, congratulations. And I said, congratulations for what? And he said, well, you've been confirmed. And so that's, how there were a lot of, ins and outs in that, but that's basically my story. But before I go on, I want to say that, Chief Judge, I didn't realize that Chief Judge Davis was such a young man. And the hat I have on, he says, "Oh, I see you're a Boston fan." Now, for those of you who are following the baseball playoffs, yes, Boston's involved, but the other team, one of the other teams is the Los Angeles Dodgers, formerly the Brooklyn Dodgers. So that's where my allegiance lies at this time. Okay, that's enough.
Well, thank you. And the young Judge Davis, would you like to tell us your story of becoming a judge, 2004 or 3?
Yes, thank you, Judge Allen. 2004. Before I start, let me just thank Brad and Jenna and Judge Allen for putting this together. I take some pride in this because the Historical Society was an initiative of mine, and so this is very nice to see. Can you all hear me?
Well,
Can you hear me okay?
You're breaking up a little bit, and we have a message that says you have network low bandwidth.
Ah, okay. Well, I'll continue. Hopefully it'll get better. Anyway, I am excited to participate. My story is rather unusual, as many of our stories will be. And when in 2000, President George W. Bush was elected, and at the time I was teaching law school, and thought that I had an interest in international relations and the State Department. So I actually applied for a position at the State Department in 2000 or so, and heard nothing on the computer, on the Plum Book. You might have heard of that in the past, but it was all computerized then. So I applied for a position at the State Department and heard nothing until maybe it was in 2001 when I got a call from John Ashcroft, who was then the Attorney General, asking if I might be interested in the War Crimes Tribunal, which was a part-time commission to resolve war crime issues. It would have allowed me to stay at the law school without interruption, but periodically go to Washington, D.C. So that process began, but it went in a different direction. So I was not appointed to the commission, and I think they appointed whoever else they were talking with. Then I heard nothing, and a couple of years passed, and I got a call out of the blue from someone asking me, from the White House Personnel Office, asking if I might have an interest in the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. And unlike my colleagues, both Judge Hagel and Judge Green, I had not a clue about this court. I had no background in veterans law. I did teach in the administrative law area, but I knew nothing about the court. So I began to look into it and indicated I certainly would have an interest, though I really never thought about being a judge. And I had just gotten off of active duty with the Navy after 9/11, so I was not particularly all that interested in, going to the bench, or even thought I could. I mean, I was interested in teaching at the law school, getting back into my writing and teaching career. So I did some background checking and saw that the court was a new court dealing with veterans. It was interesting. So I decided to fly up to Washington at my expense and interview. I don't remember who all was at the interview, but I know the general counsel of the VA was there. A couple of people in the White House counsel's office were there. And after a full day of talking with folks, they asked me what I thought. at the end of the day, and I said, I'm not really sure. I'm just getting off of active duty. I want to go back to teaching. I'm happy in Florida. Don't want to move back to Washington, D.C. And they said, well, why don't you think about it for a week or so? So I came back to Florida, gave it some thought. Now, how often is it that you have the opportunity to become a federal judge? And obviously that kind of made the decision much easier for me at the time. So thinking that there was no way I would be appointed because I didn't know anyone politically. And I knew that the court was seated in Washington, D.C., there'd be a lot of very qualified people who were interested in that position. I was an unknown. And shortly thereafter, I got a call from the White House that said the president has decided to nominate you, and that just completely floored me. Totally unexpected. I was happy, obviously excited, and that happened around 2002, 2003, I guess. So that's what happened, and I actually had several occasions to think about, once I was on the bench, think about becoming the chief, and every time that thought crossed my mind, I said no. I had no interest, and Judge Hagel can attest to that. I had absolutely no interest in being the chief judge, and that from day one, actually. And when it came time to make that decision, I thought about it, and it occurred to me that you don't have an opportunity to help to move forward certain initiatives as a chief judge of a court every day. So much to my own surprise, because this was literally a last minute decision, because Judge Hagel put pressure on those of us who were in line when he was leaving. A last minute decision, I decided to take the job. I had already told, I believe Judge Sholin was in line next. I'd already told her I wasn't going to take it a year ago. And I changed my mind and became the chief judge. And I have to say, it was probably one of the richest, most rewarding experiences, in addition to many, many others. But it was quite challenging, and I enjoyed it very much.
So I'm going to pick up with that, and I'll come back to Judge Green here. But what I want to have you each talk a little bit about is, as you were coming into the job, what did you see as your focus, your plan, whatever you want to think about it? And then how did that change over time? And what I mean by that is, I don't know what Chief Judge Bartley's focus was planned to be, but I'm willing to bet my house that it wasn't going to be managing the court during a pandemic. Yet that has defined the first 2 years of her term. And so none of you faced a pandemic, but you probably had plans, and then things came up that you had to deal with. And so if you want to talk a little bit about that, Judge Green.
So we were talking about my becoming the chief judge. And one thing that came in my mind around 2003, and Judge Nebaker having retired, and then Judge Holdaway retiring, and knowing how long it took to get a nomination through and then to appointment, and then knowing too that the remaining judges all came in on the same time, so they would be leaving at the same time, that I would possibly come to court one day as the only judge on the court, at which point I would then appoint myself as the chief judge. And so fortunately, Judges Castle and Hagel came on board in December 2004. And then we were a court of five until such time as we were able to get the final 4 people on board with Judge Mormon, Judge Lanch, Judge Davis, and Judge Sholin. I consider myself at that point a bridge from the old court, the junior judge on the old court, to the senior judge on the new court. And as a result, my focus at the time was to try to build a very collegial court, a court that had to have new beginnings. And that was the theme of my whole tenure, the new beginnings. And we had a significant trailblazing by the old court, but now we had to move forward and do what was necessary to meet the challenges of the VCAA and so on. So consequently, and to do that, I wanted to build that collegiality. I wanted to broaden the Bar Association, get them more involved with the court, and established with the then president a bench and bar conference, hoping that would be a recurring event so that there would be that interchange between the court and the bar in that kind of neutral setting outside of the annual conferences that we were required to have by statute. So from that first bench and bar, a lot of things came out of that came into fruition. We were looking at electronic filing of the court. That was a very significant thing that we had to consider, given that if you came to our court before 2004, you would see nothing but paperwork all over the 9th floor belonging to the public office. And of course, all of our records in chambers were passed by hard copy for review. And we needed to get a association with the Senate and House Veterans Affairs Committee to get them on our side to understand what we needed as a court going forward in the future. Senator Craig from the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee became a very good friend of the court. He actually visited the court from time to time, got to see the bins of paper on the 9th floor, and did his part along with the Senate Finance Committee to get us the necessary funds to establish electronic filing. And as a result, we got the money, and the Senate also said, by the way, court, you will partner with the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, who already had an up and running system, which gave us a great opportunity to just mirror what the Article 3 courts were doing. We contracted some IT people to concentrate solely on putting that, putting that on the burner, and got that moving. And Norm Herring and those people did a good job in getting us up and running. The IT folks at the court established a website that would be usable for electronic filing, and it's now morphed into a very outstanding website over the past 15 years. With the electronic filing, we also, Senator Craig noticed that we had 5 judges on the court until the new judges came in December of 2004. And somehow there became a policy that when you became a new judge, instead of having motions practice, you just got a chance to sit around for about 3 or 4 months and get a feel of the court. Telemarketers, I'm sorry.
It's all of Judge Hagel's friends calling you, actually.
And so my first year was, I was called up on the Hill about our backlog and what we were going to do about it. We had recall authority as part of that legislation that went back to when they changed the way the chief judge was going to be selected. But recall judges, none of the retired judges had been recalled by the previous chief judges. So it was apparent that I was going to have to start some process in recalling the judges, and I had to do it from scratch. There was couldn't really plan on it. I went to the hearing one day, and the next day the mission was clear. Recall judges had to get involved. And so the best I could do was contact those recall judges, put them on alert, establish a schedule for them. I used CLS as the law clerks, and the chief judge having 2 executive assistants, I allowed one of those executive assistants to serve as the executive assistants to the recall judges when they came on duty. So that began the process of recalling judges. The biggie, too, was Judge Kramer was dead set on an independent courthouse. And so that too became a focus on that I had to accomplish. And I had a personal preference of just taking over building 600 on Indiana Avenue and just make that the courthouse. But talking with Senator Craig and explaining the pros and cons of that, he was very helpful in getting a statute passed for us to do a feasibility study on whether to have it at 600 Indiana Avenue or at some other independent location within the National Capital Region. So we went out looking for locations and had a feasibility study. Then we found a couple of locations, and we hired an architect out of Philadelphia who came up with some very nice designs depending upon those locations and depending upon our wants and needs, which equated into costs. And that was going pretty well. And we got a lot of support, not only from the Senate, but all the veteran service organizations were behind it. And so the momentum was there to hopefully to get something accomplished. The big problem was the GSA had identified a location finally out in Southeast, right by the national baseball park, which is also near a metro station, and soon to be a very budding neighborhood within the Washington, D.C. Southeast, I think it was 1/2 M Street or something like that. And we needed a little more space than just what that lot provided that GSA owned. There was a small lot in front of the adjacent to it that needed to be purchased. And then we had to convince the city to convert an alleyway that belonged to the city to the courthouse. And those were some of that consumed me for 3-4 years. Unfortunately, by the time I was to retire, those two last things had not been accomplished. And then there was an economic downturn, a big economic downturn, which I guess militated against asking Congress for all the money to do that. So in the meantime, we didn't do much at 600 Indiana Avenue because we just took a short-term lease on the hope that within 5 years, we would just be moving to a new courthouse. I'm glad to see, though, that after 2010, that things we've done at 600 Indiana Avenue has been outstanding. And it sits pretty well as a courthouse now, but we never should give up the site for our own independent Veterans Courthouse. Outreach expanded. And as you know, Judge Allen, the moot court program went from a few schools to many schools. And I think we saw the new beginnings take root in those 5 years.
And this year, just so you know, Judge Green, we have the largest field of competitions ever, even with a virtual competition with 28 schools. So, in fact, so Judge Hagel, what about you as you came in? What was your focus, and did that change in the time you were chief?
There we go. Well, I was in an odd position in the sense that I knew that because my term was ending shortly, I was not going to have a lot of time as a chief judge. So despite the fact I had lots of ideas, I really didn't have a lot of time to do it. So I tried to concentrate on a couple things. And the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to focus on the staff of the court and try to do some things for them. And I think I was successful in some and not successful in others. The second thing I wanted to do, from the time I came into the court, I was very interested in expanding the availability of oral arguments, and not just in Washington, D.C. And that was done during the time that Chief Judge Green was the chief judge. We did that. And I think even when Chief Judge Kramer was the chief judge, we began to travel some. But our sites where we went to were almost exclusively law schools. The court is set at least twice, once in a state court and once in another federal court. And all the other times we've gone, the court has gone outside of Washington, D.C. It's been at law schools, which is a good thing because you reach an audience of law professors and law students, aspiring lawyers, and you educate them about the court. But the one thing that you don't do when you go to law schools is you don't reach practicing lawyers, currently practicing, who can have an immediate exposure to the court and an immediate, not only exposure to the court, but immediate influence on veterans in a local area. We have really very experienced regular practitioners at the court, and they are fantastic. And I continued to be impressed with them all the time I was a judge. But having been a veterans advocate myself and been associated with them before becoming a judge, it was my belief, it's still my belief, that people looking at the veterans system from the outside is where you begin to get innovation. And because people look at problems or issues a different way. So that's number one. Number two, because the number of veterans advocates are somewhat limited in geography, veterans are separated in great distance from the people representing them. And I think that is something that I think it would be better if they were closer in proximity. So I was really trying to figure out a way that we could have oral arguments virtually. It was quite a challenge, both I think internally in the court and also figuring out the external aspects of it. But guess what? God intervened. And so he obviously thought that, Saint Chief Judge Hagel had the right idea. So I know that the court now has, I've obviously been doing oral arguments, has their own YouTube channel, and that has enabled the court to be exposed much more broadly. I do not know whether or not it has encouraged more advocates in local areas to become involved with veterans and so forth. But I think it's very important. I think it's a very important thing. And indeed, I had suggested at one point that the rules be modified to give advocates the opportunity to make a motion to appear virtually. And that could either be granted or not. Nobody would have to be forced to appear virtually, in my view, but they would have the option to make that motion, and depending on circumstances, that could be dealt with as a motion. So anyway, when the pandemic ends, that's something I think is very important. So that was one thing that I tried to work on. And actually, when I was recalled once, I actually did conduct the court's first remote oral argument, where I sat in the U.S. District Court in D.C. and one of our advocates appeared at a U.S. District Court in Kansas, and we had an oral argument, single judge oral argument, to test the system out and so forth. So that was one thing I worked on, and like I said, only God could make it happen. So another thing, just like Chief Judge Green said, the courthouse, I think, is very important as far as the status of the court in terms of how it's viewed in the larger legal community. Just like many things, anywhere, appearance does have a meaning. And to have your own designated set-aside courthouse says something about the permanence of an institution and its importance. And so I thought that was important. And so I, again, with a short period of time, I tried to attack that. But you find that as a chief judge, things, life intervenes. And you've got a lot of things to worry about. You carry a regular caseload, number one. And number two, you have other administrative duties. And so working on a project for the courthouse is, as you got a hint from Chief Judge Green, is an involved thing. And so I did not make much progress at that. We made some, but not a lot. And in my view, another approach is going, if the court really wants to do that, another system has to be set up to allow the court to set parameters for what is to be done, and then to have some sort of group that can be have a longer standing time period to operate on it to make it successful. So the other thing that I did, and again, following on Chief Judge Green's comments, was the recall of judges fell solely on the chief judge, and the expectations were varied. And so I established a committee involving, and as I contacted Chief Judge Ivers and asked if he would chair a committee of retired or recall eligible chief judges and judges of the court to discuss the problem and come up with a policy about how this should be done. Chief Judge Ivers readily accepted. He immediately asked that Chief Judge Kramer be made a part of that committee, and the two newest judges at that time was now Chief Judge Bartley and Judge Peach. And they worked for a number of months and did a lot of work, came up with a draft policy, which was discussed at the Board of Judges and ultimately accepted. And consequently, in my view, it was important for the court and important for the chief judge, because the chief judge didn't have to start that process anew. The recall eligible judges understood the way the process would work, and so I'll let anybody that wants to comment on whether it works well, better, or worse. But I considered that, quite frankly, something that I thought was important and actually was able to accomplish. But I would say that Chief Judge Green talked about thinking about becoming chief judge. I only say I'll offer one other thought on that, is that as I told you before, I had not really contemplated becoming a judge, and so I really had never stayed up on the changes in legislation and so forth in the court. And as far as I was concerned, when I became a judge, the president still appointed the chief judge. So when I became a judge, the first thing I did was, when I was first nominated or confirmed, I went to each judge to talk with current judge, to talk with them, and even though I knew them all, to sort of introduce myself as one of their soon-to-be colleagues. And the last judge I talked to was, when I talked to Judge Kramer, he told me, he says that he carried a full caseload, that at least 30% of his time was dealt with administrative matters, and then he had this augmented staff. And so the last judge I talked to was Judge Steinberg. And Judge Steinberg, the first thing he said to me, he said was, the first thing he said is, do you know what's not on my desk or in my chambers? I said, no. And he was very proud to tell me that he did not have a computer in his chambers and he never used one. But the next thing he said is, do you realize that you'll be the chief judge of this court one day? And I said, I will not. The statute says that these are appointed by the president. He said, oh, no, we changed that. And so it's either going to be you or Judge Castle, depending on who has their commission signed first. And so I said, really? I said, well, I talked to Chief Judge Kramer, and he told me that he has a full caseload, and Judge Steinberg said yes. I said about 30% of his time he has to deal with administrative matters. And Judge Steinberg said yes. And he gets the same pay as the other judges. And Judge Steinberg said yes. And I said to Judge Steinberg, I said, well, why in the hell would anybody want to be the chief judge of this court? It is a difficult position in my view, and it does have its challenges and it has its opportunities. And I think those who had an opportunity to spend a longer time can reap the full benefits of being the chief judge and have an impact on how the judge work, how the court works, and how the judges work together.
Well, and just one point on the fact that the seeds you plant actually do grow down the road is, first of all, on December 2nd, Chief Judge Bartley, Judge Falvey, and I are going to hear oral arguments to test out technology where the three of us will be on the bench in Washington, but both lawyers will be appearing remotely. And Chief Judge Bartley and the IT staff have put that into place precisely to allow the opportunity for counsel to appear remotely even after the pandemic. So that's in the works. And in mid-January, Judge Falvey and Judge Jaquith and I are going to be hearing oral arguments in Tallahassee, Florida, but not at a law school, at the First District Court of Appeal, which is the appellate court for that area of Florida, and in conjunction with the appellate inn of court, so appellate lawyers. So the things that you were talking about now actually do bear fruit down the road. So, and now Judge Davis, what about you and your thought going in and what it turned out to be?
I had three areas that I wanted to focus on, but let me just make a comment about Judge Green being the bridge from the first generation to the second, and Judge Hagel really planting seeds and those seeds growing. I think many of us who do take over the chief's job end up carrying seeds that have been planted forward. That's true in the courthouse initiatives as well as in some of the technology initiatives. So those are very important things, and I give credit to Judge Green and Judge Hagel for their leadership in that regard. I had three primary goals. One was to focus on doing everything I could for the court staff. That sounds like something that Judge Hagel also initiated, so I would say that's a follow-up with one of his initiatives. Outreach with respect to Congress, our constituency groups, including the Bar Association, and our law school outreach efforts. I wanted to continue to fully support that. And collegiality was very important to me, and I think to the court, to any court. Situations where we needed to improve our working relationships within the court. So the new judges that came on board I wanted to make sure that they understood how important collegiality was. And without good working relationships with our colleagues, I'm talking about the judges, things are very difficult. It's hard enough to get issues, let alone, if there are personality conflicts or things like that, then that doesn't contribute to making progress. And the fourth area, which is really a carry-on, is the courthouse initiative. In today's environment, I think we should still continue to either turn 625 Indiana Avenue into our court building or find a standalone place near Judiciary Square. But some of my time, a good amount of my time, was spent in a couple of pursuits of a courthouse. And in hindsight, those efforts were not successful. I think we paved the way for success in the future at some point, but in this environment with remote work and all, that doesn't seem to be as pressing as it was at the time. But I had a fairly clear agenda, and that was my approach.
Great. So I want to remind the folks out there to, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We're going to try to leave some room at the end to see we get all your questions in. And so I'm going to ask one more, and then we can go to the chat and see what we've got. And I'm going to start with you, Judge Davis, and I'm going to go backwards in line. So just assume, hypothetically, that there were a judge, perhaps a judge on this call, who will likely succeed Chief Judge Bartley as Chief Judge of the court. So what advice would you give that hypothetical Chief Judge?
Wow, it's a great question. I'd probably start with a quote from John F. Kennedy that says, "Change is the law of life, and those of us who stay in the past or our feet too grounded in the present are sure to miss out on the promise of the future." Be flexible, keep an open mind, and be prepared for challenges. I think, as has been pointed out, the job is a demanding one, and in addition to managing cases. So you have to juggle time, juggle issues, balance personalities, judicial temperaments, all those things come into play. One of the things that I stopped doing when I took the bench was I stopped participating in the American Arbitration Association. And that was, negotiation, mediation, ADR issues. And lo and behold, once I got to the court, those skills became so important as we tried to find common ground on issues and panel decisions and things like that. So I would tell the new incoming Chief Judge to try to assess where the priorities need to be, particularly in light of this global pandemic and how we are working remotely now, how that has totally changed our approach to doing business, what impact that will have on a courthouse project, but ultimately have a few goals that you've thought about and attempt to accomplish and work toward making those initiatives happen.
And so what about you, Judge Hagel? What advice would you give this hypothetical next Chief Judge? And let me say before you answer that I'm having t-shirts made that say "Long live Chief Judge Bartley," but eventually even her term will end. So what would you say to the next Chief Judge?
Okay, all right. Am I on now? Okay. Well, It's when I became the chief judge, looking at it from the outside is quite different, as you can imagine, is actually being the chief judge. So dealing with judges is, as a colleague, is one thing. Dealing with judges as the head of the court is quite another. And as a matter of fact, it became so convoluted that toward the end of my predecessor's term, and finally, I think, during my term, the IOP, Internal Operating Procedure 13, was made more specific to show what the chief judge can do, is entitled to do, and what the Board of Judges can do. So I think the thing that I would say is that there are, I think, two relationships that a chief judge really should dedicate themselves to, or would be helpful. First is to learn how to develop a consensus. If you as a chief judge have an idea about something that you want to have happen, or you think is valuable for the court, then the first thing I think is important is to informally talk to other judges, try to form a general consensus about the validity of your idea, because no matter how good you think the idea is, it may not be a good idea, and certainly if others don't share it, it'll never become an actuality. The second is to understand the relationship with Congress and the congressional staffs. I think that's a difficult one because, first of all, it was difficult for me because I had no experience with it, with dealing with Congress. And it's also difficult, I think, because it's important for the court to keep its status as a judicial entity. And Congress has control of funding, and they have control of certain other things, but they should not, in my view, have control of operations of the court. However, Congress has the ability to pass statutes that affect the court. So how to maintain that relationship in a way where you can give input that is important, and the Board of Judges itself agrees you should take a position on, and how to keep a relationship active that does not somehow lessen the idea that the court is a separate judicial entity and has to have its independence and operations is a difficult thing, and at least for me. And so that I think is important for a future judge to think about and seek guidance on.
And what about you, Judge Green?
I concur in all that has been said. I would add that if I'm talking to the next chief judge, I would say, you have tremendous talent on the Board of Judges. Embrace them, take advantage of their talents, and make them part of the participative management. As I did with my colleagues, I tried to give them areas of responsibility that would promote the court. I got kind of lazy on it because they did such a great job. I wouldn't shift it around. So the two judges here with me tonight, Judges Hagel and Davis, they were my education committee, and they did a tremendous job in the conferences that we held, and the bench and bar conference. And I think those were very meaningful for all of our jurisprudence. In fact, I've got to mention two other things that occurred because of their emphasis, and that was that bench and bar conference, and through Judge Davis's mediation experience, allowed us to convince Congress to give us the necessary money to to train up our CLS attorneys to become mediators. And that beefed up our Article 33 conferences, which, as you know now, are the lifeblood of the court. So that was a biggie. And then, of course, the individuals that were on the congressional committees and the IT committee was Judge Davis as well, did immeasurable work for the court. During my tenure, we were able to get Congress to expand our court from 7 judges to 9 judges because of the caseload. And I think what's coming now is that we've got every reason to ask them now for maybe even 2 more positions, albeit temporarily. But I would certainly tell them to do that, to embrace that talent that's on the Board of Judges. Most importantly, take care of the people in the court staff, the people on the 9th floor, the marshals, everyone. You've got to embrace them and maintain that sense of court family, because it is a great place to work. We have a great situation in that we do have our independent budget. It doesn't have to go through OMB. We can call many of our shots by dealing collegially with the Hill and maintain that good relationship with the House and the Senate, so that that means going out to lunch with them or whatever it takes to build a sufficient rapport to be able to ask them in the future for something that you feel the court needs. So that's where my focus would be.
Well, so that was all great advice, and I appreciate that personally. And so, Brad, do we have any questions from the chat? I've got a couple of more things to ask, but I want to make sure people's questions get there.
So we do have one question in the chat, and it is, what did the judges look for in law clerks, and what changes did you see in hiring practices over your time as a judge? I think the follow-up to that is, what suggestions do you have now for the current judges as it relates to their hiring?
Judge Hagel, you want to start out with that one?
Sure. First of all, choosing a law clerk is really, I think, has a lot to do with the personality and background of the judge. So I don't think there's one size fits all for judges, but I can only say what my philosophy was. When I came to the court, I knew a couple of things. Well, first of all, as I said, it was somewhat of a surprise to me that I actually was named a judge. So I thought, quite honestly, that I would come to the court and somebody'd show me my office and my desk, and there would be a full staff of people, and everything would be, I would just sit down and start doing my job. I quickly realized that that wasn't the case when I met with Judge Ivers. He said, "So, do you have your robe yet?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh yeah, you've got to hire a secretary, you've got to hire law clerks." So anyway, so the first thing I did was there were judges who were leaving, and so I contacted those judges, and I said, "Would any of your law clerks like to stay for another year to serve in my chambers?" I thought that was important because even though I was somewhat familiar with the law and the law itself, I was not at all familiar with how the court actually worked mechanically, internally. And so my first 3 law clerks, we had 3 at the time, came from other chambers, and that was a big help. But I only wanted them to be there for a year, and then I began to hire my own law clerks. And I then hired law clerks for a 2-year period, and I focused primarily on hiring law clerks who were right out of law school. Again, that kind of goes similar to what I was talking about in a similar vein to my thoughts about having more lawyers involved. I think a person coming out of law school right away is really current with the law, not veterans benefits, but the law. So I looked at somebody who was relatively young in the legal profession because I thought they were more up to date in the changing law. The next thing I looked for was somebody who had experience in who had published something, either in a law review or had been in a moot court competition or something where they had to write something. And the reason I did that was because knowing I'd only have somebody for a couple of years, like we didn't have time to teach people the blue book. And so I wanted somebody that already knew that. And the other thing was I looked for somebody who was in a relatively high in their graduating class. Not because being a high in your graduating class makes you a good lawyer. I don't think it necessarily it equates to that. But it means that you can read things in a book and assimilate them quickly for a test, basically. And law clerks, when they came, very few law schools, when I was a judge, taught the law of veterans benefits. So clerks had to learn on their own. Well, with the assistance of other clerks. And so those were the criteria that I had. And judges could have one senior law clerk. And so I had one I had a couple of them. And then as I was ready to become chief judge, I wanted stability. I didn't want to have to worry about new law clerks. And so I kept my chambers was relatively stable from about, I guess, 2 years before, maybe a year before I became chief judge. There was no turnover. So that was my thoughts about. Those are my thoughts about it.
And Judge Davis, what about you?
Yes, I took a little different approach. First of all, I kept my law clerks early on for much longer than what had been the norm in 2004, because I know for me it was very difficult to pick up substantively this area of the law, and a year as a law clerk didn't give you much to work with. I mean, it takes some time if you have no experience and background in the area. So I looked for people who basically were smart, not necessarily top of their class, but just showed their intelligence, who had diverse backgrounds, well-rounded, maybe traveled some, but particularly are interested and excited about researching and writing, because that's most of what you do as a law clerk. So that's what I looked for, and obviously people that I felt could get along well with me as well as with other court staff. Things are very different now in comparison to 2004, because now I think more and more judges are keeping clerks well beyond 2 years. And we have the recall operation that Judge Green and Judge Hagel put into practice, and it's operating very well too. Being a recall judge now with law clerks who have been there for years. So that's what I look for, basically smart people who were excited about the opportunity to work at the court.
And Judge Green?
Well, indeed, there are a lot of smart young people out there, and that's a blessing. You look at those resumes, and then you sit and pick out 3 or 4 people that you think, based upon those transcripts and resumes, that fit well with you as an individual judge, as Judge Hagel mentioned. When I started, we had two clerks, and I normally had one clerk for 1 year and the other one for 2 years. As the caseload increased, when Judge Kramer was the chief judge, we went to 3 clerks. And that then started the idea of a senior clerk. And then that senior clerk became very instrumental in my selection of future clerks, because that senior clerk interviewed the person as well and looked at the dynamics, not only of the academic capability, but also the personality. Will this person fit in with the other 2 clerks? then when, as I was the chief, we went from 3 clerks to 4 clerks. And of course, when I became chief, I wasn't looking for any more clerks. As Judge Hagel mentioned, you got so much going on that you needed stability. And as long as those clerks were willing to stay, I was willing to let them stay, as long as they were doing good work. And so I don't recall hiring any law clerks when I was chief judge. I had a lot of interns who then became clerks. So I guess they were sort of homegrown, and that's how I operated.
Well, so we've got a couple of minutes left, so we're going to do a little bit of a speed round of some things here. All right. So the first thing is to lighten this up a little bit. If there were one funny thing that happened while you were judge, and you've all frozen on me. No, there you go. You all froze for a moment. If there was one thing that happened when you were judge, it doesn't have to be when you were chief judge, a funny moment as a judge that you can share with folks. Chief Judge Green.
I won't call it funny, but it was really cool. Right after I became chief judge, and I had all these the newbie judges, the four new judges, and then Judge Hagel and Judge Castle. And of course, I continued to want to complete this bridge. So I held an offsite in Williamsburg, where we invited the bar, all the players, the board, the general counsel, just to get an orientation on what we needed to do as a court. And after one day session, we had dinner at one of the restaurants there in Old Town Williamsburg. And unbeknownst to me at the time, the clerk had arranged for all the judges, and some of us had our spouses there too, to be escorted from the hotel, the Williamsburg Inn, to the restaurant by the Fife and Drum Corps. And we marched across the grounds of Old Williamsburg to the fifes and the beating of the drums, and then all the tourists were there, and they were saying, "Who are those people?" You know, and of course we kind of bucked up and marched across in line with the drum and the fife, and I said, "It's only fitting for the Veterans Court."
I agree. That is cool. Judge Hagel, your sort of funny, or we can now expand it to cool moment.
Well, I already told you about my interaction with Judge Steinberg, but Judge Green reminded me of another event, and it happened at that same conference. The final event of the conference was a dinner that we had, and for all the participants and the judges and the staff that helped put together the conference, and the guests that we had to give presentations. And so Chief Judge Green introduced all of the new judges, and he gave them an opportunity to say something. And Judge Lance got up and he says, Chief Judge Green, you've referred to us as the new judges. There are 4 of us, and we prefer to be referred to as the majority. So that's as close as you're going to get to a funny incident for me.
Well, I thank you for the answer, but I will say, before I went on the bench, I was at a conference where you spoke as chief judge and did the funniest thing I have ever seen a judicial officer do. Without breaking a smile, he is giving a speech to Nova, and as he takes his jacket off and he takes his tie off, and then he's still just talking about the law, and he starts to unbutton his shirt. And we are all, "Oh my God, what is this?" And lo and behold, he's wearing a Chicago Cubs uniform if the conference was in Chicago. And that was the best thing I've ever seen anybody do. Judge Davis, can you beat that?
Well, I don't know if I can beat that, but 2 points. One, I think Judge Lance's comment was the new majority, right, Larry? The new majority. And actually, I think the funny moment for me also involves Judge Lance. So that says something about our colleague, Judge Lance. And I believe it was at a NOVA conference, maybe, or maybe it was at one of our judicial conferences on the Meet the New Judges or one of those kinds of panels. Anyway, the question was posed to all of us, and it came to me finally, what was the biggest surprise for me in coming to the bench? And I mean, you know, biggest surprise, I didn't quite know how to answer that, but immediately I said, well, Judge Lance was the biggest surprise. And because of his personality and, you know, wit and all that. So we got a chuckle out of that. So.
Boy, I concur with that. That's funny. So here's the last question that I want to pose to you. If somebody were, if you wanted somebody to remember sort of one thing about your time as chief judge, a word, a phrase, it doesn't have to be the biggest accomplishment or something, but if you had to sort of put it into a sort of the elevator style speech of this, what would you want people to remember from you? And I'm going to go in reverse order. I'll start with Judge Davis.
Wow, that's a tough one, Mike. Probably, I would say fairness and action.
Good answer.
That's what I'd like to be remembered for.
And Judge Hagel.
Again, a very difficult question, but first of all, what people remember is not what you want necessarily. That's what people's attitude or thoughts are. But if I had to say what I would want somebody to remember is, number one, that I listened to them. I understood what they were asking the court to do, and that I made a fair judgment, and I explained that to them. That's it.
And Judge Green.
Legally efficient, totally caring for others, and kind.
Well, I think for all of you, I can say that a lot of people are going to remember you all for exactly what you want them to remember, not just something else, Judge Hagel. And so I just want to take a moment to say that, and I know Brad is going to thank you all, but certainly as somebody who's sitting on the court now and has been involved in the court's history book project, which is going to be coming out, it is literally on a ship as we speak now, being shipped to the United States. No exaggeration. And one of the things that you'll see in that book, which I really want to give a lot of compliments to the authors, Diane Rober and Rory Riley, because this is a really fantastic book. And what you see is the history of this institution that started literally with nothing and then has sort of become what it is today. And so as somebody who's sitting on the court now, I just want to thank all three of you, not just for participating in the panel today, but for the role that you had in transitioning and helping this institution grow to what it's been today, because it really would not have been possible without the three of you and the accomplishments that you put in. And so as we like to say, we thank you for your service, but I mean that in this sense, in your judicial service, because you paved the way for the rest of us to do this. And so thank you very much. It's been an honor to be able to be on the panel with you today.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to reflect on some of these things.
And so, Brad?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you, Your Honors. Thank you, Judge Green, Judge Hagel, Judge Davis, and Judge Allen for moderating. This has been a wonderful explanation of different periods of the court's history, and it's incredibly important. Thank you all for those of you who joined us today. We are hoping eventually to have an in-person event again, but not quite yet. We're very hopeful for 2022 and to do something back in Washington, D.C. and get everyone together both formally and informally, which we all enjoy. So thank you again. Thank you, Jenna and the Bar Association for their help in sponsoring this, and thank you all the attendees.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Real pleasure. Okay.